a whisper buried beneath decades of silence, a secret room no one dares remember, and a name erased from every page but one. Tonight's case begins not with violence, but with vanishing, of memory, of truth, of identity itself. What happens when a soul isn't just lost, but deliberately hidden? And who will dare bring her back? Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a chill and mist-strewn evening in early March that Holmes and I, having attended a performance of Schumann at St. James's Hall, stepped once more into the gaslit stir of London's night. The music, though delicate in its harmonies, had failed to displace the persistent restlessness that so often seized Holmes in periods of enforced inactivity. For my part, I had found it rather soothing, a brief balm against the bleakness of the season. We passed along Pall Mall in companionable silence, Holmes wrapped in the high collar of his Inverness, his eyes darting beneath the brim of his hat, ever alert to the ebb and flow of the city's secrets. There was in him a nervous energy that the concert had only half quelled, and I noted the occasional twitch of his long fingers, as though some unseen calculation were brewing in the machinery of his mind. As we approached the corner of Berry Street, Holmes's pace slowed. Without warning, he halted entirely, one hand lifting gently to stay my own stride. He was staring down at the pavement, not with alarm, but with that precise intensity which heralded the beginning of something. At his feet, just within the reach of the lamplight, lay a small, damp handkerchief, its corner folded beneath itself, the fabric pale and delicately embroidered. Holmes knelt without hesitation, his gloved fingers turning it gently. I saw then, embroidered in fading thread, the initials CM, and just beneath them, a faint smudge of what may have been soot or ash. A child's handkerchief, Holmes murmured, more to himself than to me. The work of a governess or elder relation. Note the stitching, done by hand and not by the child herself. See how the thread is taut here and slack there. Recent tears, and not merely sentimental ones. The fibres are clumped. The scent of coal smoke and rain. She has been running. You deduce a great deal from so slight a token, I said, peering down. She is no more than 9 years old, Watson. Left-handed, judging by the fold pattern, and frightened, terribly so. He rose slowly, slipping the cloth into his pocket. The question is not what she dropped, but what she fled. There was something in his voice, low, precise, and grave, that suggested the matter was already becoming more than idle speculation. Holmes straightened and turned his gaze towards the dim mouth of a nearby alley, where the mist curled like smoke from a smothered fire. At that moment, the steady tramp of boots approached. A constable, lantern swinging at his side, emerged from the fog. "Evening, sir," the man said, tipping his helmet with a gloved hand. "Anything amiss?" Holmes gestured lightly with his walking stick. "You patrol this route regularly, do you not?" "Half-hour intervals, sir. Nothing much to report. Though now you mention it, there was a child seen running not 20 minutes past. Barefoot, and in a frightful hurry. Headed down toward the embankment, I believe. Alone. As far as I saw, sir, she darted across the street like a hare from the brush." Holmes nodded once, then turned away. The constable, sensing no further need, continued on his way. "So," I said quietly, "there was indeed a child, and not long gone." "Yes," Holmes replied, "and running without shoes in this weather suggests no idle mischief. She is running from something, not merely away." His eyes remained fixed upon the shadows ahead, his mind, I knew, already sprinting several paces beyond the rest of us. For a time, we stood in silence, the night wind shifting through the alleys with a mournful murmur. Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the place where the child had vanished into the fog, his posture still and listening, as though the very cobblestones might confess what they had seen. "She is not merely lost, Watson," he said at last, his voice low and thoughtful. "Nor is this the work of a negligent guardian or a child's fit of fancy. There is intention in her disappearance, or rather fear. You believe she was pursued." "I believe," he said, drawing the handkerchief once more from his coat, "that this was dropped not by accident, but with purpose. A trace left, whether consciously or no, and that, my dear fellow, means she wishes to be found." The words hung in the air, suspended between the distant rattle of a carriage and the muffled drip of rain from iron gutters. Holmes turned abruptly, his coat flaring behind him. "Come, Watson, the game is already afoot, though as yet we know neither the board nor the players." And with that, we plunged once more into the fog, following only the faintest thread, a whisper on the wind. The morning following our encounter in the fog found Baker Street steeped in a rare quietude. The fire had burned low, and Holmes, cross-legged upon the hearthrug, was engrossed in a German monograph concerning the chemical analysis of ash, a subject in which he took a peculiar and relentless interest. I had resumed my perusal of the Lancet, more out of habit than curiosity, when the sharp clatter of hooves on the street below drew both our attentions. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the threshold, her brow faintly raised. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes, says the matter is urgent." "Show him in," Holmes replied simply. The visitor entered hurriedly, a tall man in a finely cut morning coat, his hair touched with grey at the temples, and a pair of kid gloves clutched nervously in his left hand. His eyes, though clear, bore the weary pallor of recent distress, and there was about his person an air of strained civility. "I am sorry to intrude so early," he began, his voice taut, "but I fear I have little choice. A young girl, my ward, has vanished." At the word vanished, Holmes laid aside his monograph. "My name," the gentleman continued, drawing a card from his breast pocket, "is Edwin Merrow. I am the legal guardian of Miss Clara Melford, daughter of my late cousin, Reginald Melford, who passed away 6 years ago in Jamaica." He took the seat Holmes gestured toward, though his posture remained rigid, as if the chair offered no comfort. "Clara has been under my protection since the age of 4. We reside in Kensington, a modest but respectable home. She is 10 now, quiet, occasionally withdrawn, but never disobedient." Merrow paused, swallowing. "Last evening she retired early. When the maid entered her room to wake her this morning, she found the bed untouched, and the girl gone. There was no forced entry, nothing taken, only the door unlocked, and the child vanished as if into smoke." Holmes regarded him for a moment in silence. "And the police? I thought to speak to you first. The matter is delicate. Clara. She has suffered from melancholy. Her mother died giving birth, and her father's absence left wounds I fear never healed. She is not entirely stable." There was something in the way he said it, a rehearsed solemnity, an effort to elicit sympathy while distancing himself from blame, that struck me as oddly rehearsed. Holmes, however, said nothing, but reached for his pipe with deliberate calm. "You speak of the child's fragility," Holmes said evenly. "Yet she has, until now, not exhibited such impulses." "None whatsoever," Merrow replied hastily. "She has always been obedient, if at times withdrawn. But lately she had grown distracted, preoccupied. I attributed it to childish fancy." "Did she have friends? Correspondents?" Merrow hesitated. "No friends of her own age, save the housemaid's daughter. She had taken to drawing, portraits mostly, nothing of note." "Any visitors recently?" "None save the usual. My solicitor, the vicar's wife on occasion. Nothing irregular." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, gazing into the thin winter light. And yet, in the space of one night, she disappears without trace. No shoes, no belongings, no note, only absence. Merrow shifted uneasily. Precisely why I came to you. The matter is odd, deeply so. I observed him closely now. Though his speech was measured, his fingers twisted the gloves in his lap with silent agitation. There was, in his recounting, something not only incomplete, but carefully curated, as though the facts were not concealed by ignorance, but design. Holmes turned slowly, his expression unreadable. And the child's room? I presume it remains untouched. Of course. Holmes resumed his seat, but leaned forward slightly, his fingertips pressed together. Mr. Merrow, did Miss Melford ever inquire about her mother? The question landed with unexpected weight. Merrow blinked. Why, I believe so. Children are curious by nature. And what was your response? That her mother died giving her life, which is the truth. There is little more to be said. Truth, Holmes repeated quietly, a malleable thing in the wrong hands. There was a flicker, no more, in Merrow's gaze. His lips pressed into a thin line. I resent the implication, sir. I've made none, Holmes replied smoothly. Merely observing the delicacy of grief and the ease with which it may become an instrument of silence. Merrow stood abruptly. If you are willing to take the case, I should be grateful. Otherwise, I must seek other avenues. Holmes inclined his head. We shall consider it. The man took his leave with restrained indignation. As the front door closed behind our visitor, Holmes remained motionless for a moment, then rose and moved to the hearth, stirring the embers thoughtfully. What do you make of him, Watson? I considered. He is grieving certainly, though his account was at times overly polished. I felt distanced from the child herself. She was spoken of more as responsibility than relation. Holmes nodded. Just so. He is a man accustomed to controlling a narrative and to being believed. Yet there are fissures in his account. You think he lies? Not in the overt sense, but he omits, and with intention. The question is not whether he misleads, but what he fears might be discovered if we inquire too deeply. He turned then, meeting my eye with quiet gravity. This is no simple case of a runaway. There is something buried, something the child may have uncovered, or perhaps remembered. You intend to investigate? Indeed, and with the utmost discretion. We shall begin with the child's room. With that, Holmes fetched his coat and gloves, and I followed him into the London morning, the faint but unmistakable chill of danger threading the air between us. It was not yet midday when we alighted from our hansom in the quieter quarter of Kensington, where Mr. Merrow's residence stood, a respectable, if unspectacular, 3-story home of narrow brick and ivy-choked railing. The maid who received us was a pale, mousy girl with downcast eyes, clearly unused to visitors of our kind. Holmes presented his card with quiet authority and made no inquiry after Mr. Merrow, whose presence, I gathered, was neither required nor desired for the task at hand. We were led directly to the girl's room, a small but tidy space on the upper floor, where the bed remained undisturbed and the pale curtains fluttered faintly against the glass. Holmes surveyed the scene with that particular detachment of his, not cold, but clinical, as though the objects themselves might confess under proper scrutiny. Nothing removed, he murmured. No suitcase, no garments, not the flight of a runaway, but of one snatched or one summoned. He dropped to one knee, studying the carpet near the bed. And yet, he said softly, not all traces have been erased. Observe, Watson, the absence of footprints here and here suggests a child stood for some time by the window, undecided. He straightened with a frown. Let us speak to the housekeeper. I suspect she has more to reveal than Mr. Merrow allowed himself to admit. The housekeeper was a stern-featured woman of advancing years, with a deep voice and an expression carved into permanent disapproval. She met us in the small servants' parlour, her hands folded in a manner that suggested both propriety and reluctance. She was a strange child, she began, answering Holmes's gentle prompt. Quiet but not dull. She kept her thoughts to herself, though she was always drawing. Faces, mostly. Women. Always the same one, I think. Holmes inclined his head. And was there anything unusual in her behaviour of late? The woman hesitated, then gave a curt nod. 3 days before she vanished, a letter arrived. The handwriting was odd, like a child's, but uncertain. It came by post, addressed to her in care of Mr. Merrow. And Mr. Merrow gave it to her. I was the one who handed it to her, sir. He wasn't home. She turned pale when she read it, white as linen. Said nothing, but that evening she refused supper and sat staring out the window. Next morning she asked if post could be sent from the grocer's. A reply? Holmes asked. The housekeeper's lips thinned. No letter left the house. Mr. Merrow found something half-written and burned it in the hearth. Said it was nonsense and best forgotten. Holmes nodded slowly, tapping his forefinger against his knee. And you believed him? I keep my place, sir, she said flatly, though her eyes betrayed the weight of something left unsaid. Holmes rose. Thank you. You have been of great assistance, though I dare say your master may not agree. Back in Clara's bedroom, Holmes resumed his quiet inspection, this time with an added urgency in his manner. He moved with deliberate care, drawing a fine blade from his coat and using it to trace the seams between the floorboards beside the bed. An old trick, he murmured, favoured by children and felons alike. Hide what you dare not destroy. He pressed gently against the third board from the foot of the bed. It gave beneath his touch. With deft fingers, he pried it upward and withdrew a flattened parcel of folded linen. From within, he drew a small, charred scrap of paper and a drawing on coarse parchment. The sketch was crude, but unmistakably earnest. A woman with strong brows and long hair, her eyes large and sorrowful. Beneath the image, a child's unsteady hand had written E.M. The same initials as her handkerchief, I observed. Holmes nodded, examining the burnt edge of the note. This would be the reply Mr. Merrow destroyed, or tried to. Clara must have rescued it. A girl does not sketch a stranger with such frequency, unless that stranger holds meaning. He turned the scrap toward the light, reading the surviving portion aloud. Find me. Truth lives below. The remainder had blackened beyond recognition. Truth lives below, Holmes repeated, voice low. A curious phrase. He glanced toward the hearth and then back to the opened floor. Clara was trying to preserve something, a voice, a memory, from being extinguished. I saw then, more than before, the shape of a mystery that was not merely physical disappearance, but erasure, deliberate and patient. Come, Holmes said quietly. There is one more place I would see. Our inquiries led us to a small printer's shop 2 streets over, tucked between a tobacconist and a pawnbroker, the kind of establishment that survived on wedding cards, handbills, and the occasional legal broadside. Holmes inquired with his usual reserve, producing the name Clara Melford with just enough hesitation to disarm suspicion. The proprietor, a ruddy-faced man with ink-stained cuffs, nodded at once. A little girl, yes. Came in 2 days ago. Said she wanted to place a notice. What sort of notice? Holmes asked. She had it written out already, just a few lines. Wanted it posted in the Evening Standard. I remember because of the name, Evangeline. Not common these days. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Do you have the original? Didn't keep it. She paid for a proof but never returned with approval, so it wasn't printed. Holmes turned to me. And there we have it, Watson. The trigger. She was trying to reach someone. Or to summon a memory long buried, he replied. Evangeline Melford. Her mother, I would wager. We exited the shop in silence, the wind sharper now, the clouds heavier. The name hung between us, Evangeline, as though spoken not in the moment, but from a place far older and more tragic. Holmes paused at the corner, eyes fixed ahead. She was not running from madness, he said quietly. She was running towards something she had never been permitted to know. We returned to Baker Street in a silence I did not disturb. Holmes seated himself at the desk, where the drawing of the sorrowful woman now lay beside the half-burnt scrap of letter. He studied both with a peculiar reverence, as one might consider the remnants of a torn confession. There is, Watson, he said at length, a curious power in names. A name withheld may obscure a lineage, an inheritance, even a crime. You believe Evangeline to be Clara's mother? I believe it is the name Clara was never meant to speak, he replied. It was hidden, not lost. This girl has been raised in a carefully curated void, one in which her origin was effaced, not forgotten. He rose and crossed to the window, the afternoon light stretching thin against the fog. Clara did not vanish in panic. She followed the faint trace of someone who had once belonged to her. Perhaps a name whispered by a maid, or glimpsed in a letter never meant for her eyes. He turned then, his gaze sharpened. We are no longer searching for a runaway. We are navigating the map of a child's unspoken past, and that map has only just begun to reveal itself. It was shortly after tea when a soft rap came at the sitting-room door, followed by the unmistakable figure of Wiggins, the eldest and most capable of Holmes's unofficial cohort, the Baker Street Irregulars. His cap was damp with drizzle, and he held it respectfully in both hands as he stood in the doorway. Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but I've news. Holmes motioned him forward. Go on, Wiggins. One of the lads what runs errands near the docks, Jem by name, says he saw a girl last night, barefoot, just like you said. She was with a gent, tall, bit sickly looking, with a stovepipe hat and gloves. Didn't say much, just led her quiet-like toward the barges. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Did she resist? Wiggins shook his head. No, sir. Looked frightened, but followed. Time. Near 10 bells by Jem's reckoning. Not long after the fog came in. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And this barge? Which way was it headed? East, sir. Tide was going out. Holmes handed the boy a coin and nodded his dismissal. Tell Jem he's earned my thanks. As Wiggins vanished, Holmes turned to me. Now we know the direction. Let us see if the river remembers more than men do. The air along the Thames had grown thick with soot and salt by the time we reached the wharf, where cranes loomed like skeletons and the water slapped restlessly against the piers. Holmes moved with quiet efficiency, speaking with dockhands and clerks in a tone at once casual and commanding. It was near the end of the line that we found our man, a burly, wind-chafed dockhand named Coyle, who paused mid-tariff to squint at Holmes's description. Aye, he said, scratching his beard. Saw a lass like that. Young white dress, no shoes. Odd sight for this part of the river. And the man with her? Didn't catch much of him. Kept his face turned. Moved stiff, like he was sick or tired. Did they speak? Not a word. He showed the bargemaster a paper. Some kind of shipping note, I reckon. Got on the Alba Rose. Goes east toward Limehouse. Sometimes further if the tide's right. Holmes nodded. When did they depart? Just before midnight. Slipped out quiet. Fog covered most of it. Holmes glanced downriver, toward the grey curve of the water where the vessel had vanished. Did the girl seem willing? Coyle paused. more like resigned. Holmes thanked him and turned away, his expression unreadable. "There is a current here, Watson," he murmured, "both literal and figurative. That child was not abducted, she was led. And wherever the Alba Rose makes port, I suspect truth awaits us, half buried in the silt." As we made our return along the embankment, Holmes walked briskly, his gaze cast not upon the path but inward, into the thickets of inference and implication where his mind so often roamed. I, for my part, felt the gravity of the case shift once more beneath my feet. What had begun as a missing persons errand was fast becoming a labyrinth. "You have a theory, then?" I asked, eager to surface whatever shape was forming in his mind. "I have the frame," he replied. "The canvas remains in shadows." He paused to adjust his gloves. "Consider, Watson, what we now know. Clara receives a letter, origin unknown, but likely from someone who once knew her mother. She attempts to place a public notice. Her guardian intercepts this effort and attempts to erase it. And yet, she does not yield. She conceals fragments, sketches a face, and vanishes." "She was searching for Evangeline," I said slowly. "Or for what the name represented," Holmes corrected. "It is not merely reunion she seeks. It is identity. Children accept what they are told, until the lie no longer fits. Something triggered her doubt. Something that led her to act. And the man in the stovepipe hat? A cipher, perhaps an ally, perhaps a jailer. But Clara went willingly. That alone reshapes our understanding." Holmes turned to face me fully. "We are no longer chasing a child's disappearance. We are retracing a path of revelation, one laid not by accident, but by purpose." He paused, eyes narrowing. "I would wager this. Whatever Clara seeks is connected not only to her mother's absence, but to something her guardian wished very deeply to remain buried." The fog thickened as we turned up Northumberland Avenue, the lamps burning dim against the dusk. "We must widen the net," Holmes said softly, "and follow not the child's footprints, but the shadows in which they vanish." The following morning saw us journeying southward through the damp and weary streets of Lambeth, where Holmes had traced the name Langmare House for distressed women, a name now faded from directories and forgotten by polite society. It had once operated under the auspices of several church charities, and, as Holmes had quietly confirmed through an examination of old legal ledgers, counted both Mr. Edwin Merrow and one Evangeline Melford among its former visitors. The building itself had long since surrendered its mission. The shutters hung crooked, the paint peeled, and weeds clutched the iron railings like green fingers grown through neglect. Yet in the adjoining lodging, preserved in dignified disrepair, we found a woman of firm posture and furrowed brow. One Miss Agnes Bray, the last matron of Langmere before its closure. Holmes introduced us with unfailing courtesy, and it was clear from the brief narrowing of her eyes that the name Merrow struck a long-dormant chord. She bade us sit, folded her work apron in her lap, and looked squarely at Holmes. "I do not know what business you've with that house, sir," she said, "but if it concerns the girl Evangeline, and I suspect it does, then you are a decade too late." Holmes offered no reply, only the calm tilt of his head, an invitation, not a demand. She drew in a breath, and with it came a memory that, though dust-covered, had never truly died. "She came to us," said Miss Bray, "in the spring of '73, no more than 19. Her name was Evangeline Melford, though she asked us not to write it in the records. Said she feared being found. She carried herself with dignity, though there was a sorrow about her, and a child growing beneath her ribs. Watson, seated beside me, remained respectfully still as she continued, her voice acquiring a measured rhythm, as if reading from pages long locked away. She said little at first, but I observed, I always do, there were no bruises, no signs of cruelty, only a silence that clung to her. She read books when she could, and never cried aloud, only in sleep. She received no letters, sent none, except, that is, for one visitor. She paused. A gentleman, middle-aged, finely dressed. He came twice, never left his name. The second time, I insisted, for the protection of the women, I said. He signed himself E. Merrow. I remember because the name struck me, precise, like a lawyer's. Holmes's eyes flicked toward mine, then back again. After his visits, the girl changed. She grew pale, hesitant. One night, I found her in the chapel weeping. She said only this: "He promised to protect me, but it's my father's estate he wants." "She said that?" Holmes asked quietly. Miss Bray nodded once. "Verbatim. I've never forgotten it." She drew herself upright. A week later she vanished. No farewell, no notice. Her room left precisely as it was. And no one, not the board, not the police, inquired after her again. Holmes leaned back, his expression unreadable. "And Langmare?" "Closed within the year," she said. "Funding withdrawn, reputation tarnished." I shall never forget the grim stillness that followed Miss Bray's words. She reached now for a small worn tin and drew from it a bundle of folded papers tied with twine. "These are the incident reports I kept," she said, "though none were ever officially filed. I was told, quite directly, that certain names ought not appear in our ledgers. It was made clear to me that Langmare survived on the generosity of powerful men, and to question their conduct would be to imperil every soul beneath our roof." Holmes accepted the bundle with a rare solemnity. "And yet you kept them." "I could not do otherwise. The girl had no one else." She gestured to a page near the top, yellowed and brittle. "That is the entry from the week she vanished. I recorded that she confronted Mr. Merrow, accused him of appropriating her father's estate through falsehoods, and of holding back funds meant for her and her unborn child." Holmes perused the entry in silence. "And no authority followed up?" I asked. Miss Bray gave a bitter smile. "On the contrary, the very next day, we received notice from the trustees that Evangeline had left voluntarily to join distant family in the north. No address, no forwarding name, just absence." Holmes stood slowly, returning the papers to their twine. "Miss Bray, you may have just resurrected a truth long buried." The woman's eyes moistened, though her voice remained firm. "Then God grant you find it." We walked a stretch in silence before Holmes spoke. Not with the crisp detachment I had come to expect, but with a gravity that clung to the edges of each word. "It fits, Watson, too well. Merrow visits a vulnerable cousin, recently orphaned and with child. He isolates her, claims legal authority over her estate, then engineers her vanishing. No police inquiry, no scandal. A charitable house quietly shuttered, and the memory of the girl dissolved." "And now, Clara," I said, barely above a whisper. Holmes nodded grimly. "The child of that same girl, raised under his roof, fed only the facts he deems appropriate. But children are not blank slates, Watson. Memory leaves residue, in letters, in drawings, in questions half-formed and quickly silenced. You believe he—" I could not say it. "I believe," Holmes said, eyes cold, "that Clara's disappearance is not the first Merrow has engineered. But perhaps this time it is not he who controls the end." He turned to me sharply. "If Clara has uncovered even a fragment of the truth, she is in danger. And the key to it all lies not in the present, but beneath the layers of Langmare's ruin." There are moments in my long association with Sherlock Holmes which I recall not for their brilliance, but for their weight, the heaviness of human consequence that even the finest deduction could not wholly lift. That evening was such a one. I could not help but think of Clara, not as a cipher in a puzzle, but as a child seeking the face of her mother in the dark. A girl whose entire life had been conducted within a fiction constructed by the very man who called himself her guardian. Langmare, I said aloud, is more than a name on a shuttered door. It is a tomb. Holmes did not correct me. We sat long into the night, the case spread across the table between us. Sketches, scraps, timelines, and names. But always, at the centre, was Clara, the girl not lost by accident, but buried by design, and now perhaps rising of her own accord. At last, Holmes folded his hands and said almost to himself, "This is not a case of where she has gone, Watson. It is a case of what she has remembered." And with that, we prepared ourselves for what memory, once stirred, might unearth. It was scarcely past 8 when the knock came, sharp, hurried, and irregular. Holmes looked up from his correspondence as I opened the door to reveal a man in dockman's garb, soaked with sweat despite the morning chill. "You're Mr. Holmes?" he asked breathlessly. "They told me to come straight." Holmes nodded. "Speak." "There's a girl, sir, barefoot, pale as death. Fished her out by the wharf down past Shadwell. Near drowned she was. Kept muttering strange-like. A copper said you was the one to fetch." Holmes was already on his feet. "She lives?" "For now. They've taken her to a shelter near the water pump. She's bad off, sir, fevered and trembling." Without another word, Holmes gathered his coat and cane. I joined him, already anticipating the haste in his stride. "Watson," he said grimly as we descended the stairs. "If it is Clara, and I fear it is, then someone has tried to silence her." I asked the question aloud that hung between us, and failed. Holmes's jaw clenched. Let us pray so. Outside, the morning had lost its calm. The case that had smouldered in secrets now flared with the urgency of peril. I found her in a dimly lit chamber above the pump yard, a makeshift infirmary maintained by a local mission. Her skin was pallid, her breath ragged, and her small frame shivering beneath the coarse blankets. Holmes stood at the foot of the cot while I knelt beside her, pressing fingers to her pulse. "Faint, but present," I murmured. "She's burning up. Exposure and fever." Her lips moved faintly, and I bent to listen. What I heard chilled me. "Below, locked, the room, under, her name, not mine. Clara," I whispered gently, "you're safe now." But her eyes remained closed, and her voice, no more than a dry rasp, returned to its litany. "Langmare, the basement, braid, her hair." Holmes crouched beside me. She speaks of Langmare again. A basement, a locked room. "She's seen something," I said, astonished. "Something that terrified her into silence, and nearly into the grave." Holmes placed a hand upon my shoulder. "It is not silence she needs now, but witness. We must go, at once, before what she found is erased." He rose and turned to the mission worker. "See that no one comes near her save this man," he said, indicating me. "And if she wakes, record every word." Then, fixing his coat, he departed. I lingered only a moment longer, brushing a strand of damp hair from Clara's brow, and followed my friend into the thickening morning mist. Holmes's instincts, once aroused, moved with unnerving speed. From the mission house, we hired a trap and made directly for Kensington. Along the way, he paused only to send a message via telegraph. Destination and contents unknown to me at the time. At Merrow's residence, a perturbed footman admitted us with hesitation. Holmes's tone left no room for refusal. "Your master," he asked, "is he in?" The man shifted nervously. "He's packing, sir. Said he must take the morning train. Unforeseen family matters." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "May I see his luggage?" The servant hesitated. I suppose." We ascended at once, the footman stammering in our wake. Inside the study, trunks lay open, papers scattered in anxious haste. Upon the bureau lay a passport, half filled, and tickets for a midday departure from Paddington. "He runs," Holmes murmured, "which tells us he has reason." He turned swiftly. "Watson, we must delay his departure, but subtly. His panic is useful. Let him believe he may yet escape." "And we follow?" "No," he said with quiet steel. "We confront. But first, I must recover what Clara sought, and what Merrow hoped to bury beneath time and brick." It was among Clara's modest belongings, a canvas satchel left behind at the mission. Holmes rifled through its contents with gloved hands, extracting a notebook, a damp handkerchief, and finally, a strange stiffness in the lining. With a deft slice, he revealed a hidden seam, and from within, drew forth a rusted iron key, long and narrow, with an ornate bow shaped like a clover. He held it aloft, studying its patina. "Not a house key," he said. "A chamber key, likely old, likely forgotten." He turned to me, his voice low. "She did not run without purpose. This she meant to use." "And it opens. The last door her mother ever knew," Holmes replied. "And perhaps the first Clara ever found." Without further word, he pocketed the key and stepped into the street. The return to Langmare was shrouded not in fog, but in foreboding. We gained quiet access through the crumbling side entrance, Holmes having already arranged discreet permission through channels he did not reveal. Inside, the air was thick with mould and the scent of abandonment. Boards creaked beneath our feet as we descended to what had once served as the service wing. There, hidden behind a splintered panel and narrow stair, we found it, a locked iron door, flush with the stone. Holmes produced the key. It turned with effort, grating like the grinding of old bones. The door swung inward, revealing a chamber sunken into darkness. I struck a match, the light dancing on brick walls scarred with age. It was not large, 10 feet by 6, but the silence there was immense. "There," Holmes said softly, "a child's cot, rusted, a table with scraps of paper curled in damp decay, and in the far corner, a length of faded ribbon wound round a coil of auburn hair." "Evangeline," I whispered. Holmes knelt, lifting the braid with care. "This is no longer a disappearance," he said. "It is a grave." I stood frozen, struck by the intimacy of the space, a prison not built of bars, but of abandonment. The cot was child-sized, its frame warped by years. The scraps on the table, fragments of letters, blurred and unsent, bore lines of pleading ink. And that braid, lovingly bound, seemed to breathe grief, even in silence. Holmes remained still for a moment, as if listening to an echo the room no longer gave. "She was meant to vanish here," he said quietly, "but the room remembered." I felt then the story shift, from mystery to mourning, and from deduction to reckoning. Upon our return from Langmare, Holmes wasted no time. A telegram was swiftly dispatched to Mr. Edwin Merrow, requesting his presence at Baker Street in the matter of Miss Clara Melford's recovery. The wording, I observed, was chosen with surgical precision, vague enough to disarm, pointed enough to compel. "He shall come," Holmes said calmly as he removed his gloves. For a man on the edge of collapse cannot resist the promise of closure. We prepared the sitting room with its usual deceptive simplicity. The morning's discovery lay in a plain wooden box atop Holmes' writing table, unmarked and unremarkable to the untrained eye. When I inquired whether we ought to inform Inspector Lestrade, Holmes demurred. "Not yet," he said. "Justice, in this instance, requires an introduction first. Let the truth settle in the ears of its architect before the law is summoned to weigh it." There was a sharpness in Holmes's tone that belied his usual detachment. I had seen him expose traitors, blackmailers, and murderers with composure, but today, beneath the crisp articulation, I detected the current of something rare, a quiet, contained fury, and as the appointed hour drew near, he turned to me and said, "Clara must hear it with her own ears." We had brought Clara from the mission house under the soft cover of night. Her condition greatly improved, though her strength remained fragile. She said little, and when she did, it was with the reserve of one who has learned that silence is safer than truth. Holmes explained the plan with gentleness, uncommon to his manner. Clara, seated beside the hearth in the adjoining chamber, listened with folded hands and solemn nods. "You will not be seen," he assured her, "but you will see. That is the difference between being used and choosing." She said only, "He will lie." "Yes," Holmes replied, "but only once." When the bell rang and steps sounded on the stair, Clara looked not to me, but to Holmes, and in her gaze was no longer the girl lost in fog, but the daughter of a woman who had vanished without a voice, now ready to listen as truth was spoken in her stead. Marrow entered with careful steps, his composure strained but intact. His eyes darted between Holmes and me, and though his voice retained its cultivated civility, the pallor of his cheek betrayed a night of unrest. "I came as requested," he said. "You said Clara was found?" Holmes gestured to the chair opposite. "Indeed, she is safe and recovering." A visible exhalation followed. "Thank heaven." "I thought it best you hear that from me," Holmes continued smoothly. "There are, however, details requiring clarification before custody is reassumed." Marrow blinked. "Custody?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "You claimed guardianship through familial connection, a cousin once removed. Yet the probate records of John Melford list only one heir, his daughter, Evangeline, with no mention of you." Marrow's lips parted. "There were complexities." "Yes," said Holmes softly, "which I should like you to illuminate." He allowed the silence to stretch. "You spoke often of Clara's melancholy," he added, "but grief rarely compels a child to flee barefoot into the night. The trap was laid not with accusation, but with civility sharpened to a point." And Marrow, sensing the shift, adjusted his collar, the first tremor before the unravelling began. Holmes reached to the table and unfolded several brittle pages, their edges blackened, their ink partially dissolved by time and heat. "These," he said, "were recovered from beneath a floorboard in Clara's chamber, written by Evangeline, intended for Clara, never delivered." Marrow said nothing, but his gaze fixed upon the papers with too much intensity for ignorance. "The script matches a sample we obtained from the Langmare ledgers," Holmes continued. "The tone, protective, pleading and afraid, tells its own tale. She wrote to her daughter with love, and with warnings." He turned one page. "This line is particularly damning. He smiles in daylight but keeps my door closed by night." Holmes folded his hands. "Did you think fire would erase her voice?" Marrow's mouth twitched, his fingers clenching upon the armrest. "I find it curious," Holmes mused aloud, "that a guardian so concerned for a child's welfare would intercept and incinerate every trace of that child's mother." The accusation, though veiled, left no doubt, and Marrow's silence was no longer calculated, but stricken. In that moment, even without confession, the man had already betrayed himself. Holmes stood, stepped to the plain wooden box, and opened it without flourish. He removed first a rusted key, long, narrow, flecked with age. "This," he said, "was sewn into the lining of Clara's satchel. Clearly intended for use, but not, alas, used in time." He laid it upon the table with a soft clink. "Last night we returned to Langmere." Marrow's eyes widened imperceptibly. "With the key we accessed a sub-chamber beneath the east wing, one unmarked on any registry, and sealed until yesterday. Within it, we found remnants." He drew forth a small, cloth-wrapped bundle and unrolled it carefully. A child's cot, nail-rusted. Fragments of torn correspondence. And lastly, with delicate precision, a single coil of auburn hair bound with faded ribbon. "Would you like to see it, Mr. Merrow?" Holmes asked coldly. "Or have you seen it before?" The man rose abruptly. "This is absurd." Holmes stepped between him and the door. "Is it? Then tell me, sir, how Evangeline's braid came to rest in a locked cellar of a property still held in your name, and why Clara, born of her, was raised to know nothing of that woman's fate." The room held its breath. And Merrow, confronted by artifacts too mute to lie, could retreat no further. His voice, when it came, was not defiant but broken. "She would not yield," he whispered. "I offered her comfort, protection, but she called me a thief." He sank into the chair once more, the mask of dignity dissolved into something pale and wrinkled by shame. "She threatened to expose me, said the inheritance was not mine to manage. She accused me of betrayal, of ambition, of cruelty." Holmes said nothing. "I did not harm her," Merrow insisted. "She fell ill, refused food, withdrew into silence. I had her moved to Langmare's lower rooms, for quiet, for care." "And when she died?" Holmes asked quietly. Merrow looked away. "She died, and no one asked, no one looked. And the child was a chance to make it right. I gave her education, a home." "You gave her a fiction," Holmes replied coldly. There was no struggle, no dramatics, only a man whom truth had reduced. Behind the adjoining door, I heard the faintest catch of breath. Clara's. Holmes turned to me and nodded. "Send for Lestrade." The trap had closed, but its purpose had not been conquest. It had been truth. And for once, Holmes did not look victorious, only tired. The silence that followed Merrow's confession was profound, as though the very air recoiled from the weight of his words. He sat hunched, diminished, the carefully constructed scaffolding of years now crumbled about his feet. Holmes did not speak, nor did I. Instead, he turned and opened the adjoining door. Clara entered. She moved with no dramatics, no trembling nor outward signs of distress. The firelight caught her pale features, made sharper still by the ordeal she had endured. Her eyes fell upon the man who had, for the better part of her life, masqueraded as protector while playing the silent architect of her mother's ruin. Merrow looked up, and for a flickering instant, some fragment of the guardian persona returned to his face, an almost pleading recognition. But Clara did not falter. She stood with both hands folded before her, saying nothing. Holmes gestured silently to the empty chair across from her former custodian. She declined it. And in that moment, that still, breathless interval where the guilty and the grieving beheld one another, no voice was necessary. Clara's silence was its own verdict, a silence forged not of fear, but of dignity reclaimed. Holmes finally broke it. "You have heard, Miss Melford." She nodded. "Then what remains is yours to say, or not." She looked once more at Merrow, then turned her gaze to the table where the braid lay, and only then did she speak. "My mother," Clara said softly, "wrote that she feared the world would forget her, that I would never know her name. Only yours." Her voice was steady, neither accusatory nor sentimental. It carried a conviction born of wounds too long endured. "She warned me," she continued, "in words you tried to burn. She wrote of silence and doors that would never open again." Merrow bowed his head, his hands clasped as though in prayer. He did not interrupt. "For years," she said, "I believed the melancholy you described was mine, that I was broken, difficult, unstable. But it was not madness. It was memory trying to wake." She paused, glancing again at Holmes, and he helped it rise. Holmes inclined his head, saying nothing. Clara turned back to Merrow. "I do not hate you," she said, with a composure that startled even me. "But I will never again believe you." Then, quietly, as though reciting a rite, she added, "My name is Clara Evangeline Melford." That name, unspoken in her home for so long, rang with a clarity that needed no further declaration. The girl who had been lost was no longer wandering. She had arrived. The knock came but moments later. 3 brisk raps upon the door. Inspector Lestrade entered with his usual businesslike stride, trailed by a uniformed constable. His eyes passed over Clara, then fixed on Merrow, who made no motion to rise. "Mr. Edwin Merrow," Lestrade intoned, "you are hereby taken into custody for investigation into the unlawful detainment, concealment of death, and misappropriation of inheritance related to the late Miss Evangeline Melford." There was no resistance. Merrow rose slowly, almost gratefully, and submitted his wrists to the constable's irons. As they led him away, he looked back only once, not to Holmes, nor to me, but to Clara. She did not return the gaze. The door closed behind them with a quiet finality. Holmes remained seated, his eyes upon the fire. In that still room, it was as though justice had passed like a solemn procession, not in thunder, but in the footfalls of truth arriving at last. Holmes stood long at the hearth, hands clasped behind his back, the flames playing against his sharp features in uneasy shadows. "I have solved murders, Watson," he said at last, his tone not boastful but grave. "Unravelled codes, toppled empires of deceit. Yet nothing in my art prepares one for the weight of a voice recovered too late." I said nothing. There was a rare weariness in him that I dared not disturb. He turned slightly. "Justice, once delayed," he murmured, "tastes bitter, even in triumph." I saw then that Clara's rescue, though complete in the eyes of the law, had exacted a toll upon Holmes. This was not a case of trophies or intellectual conquest. It was something quieter, a reckoning between memory and oblivion. Clara remained by the window, watching the last mist of evening drift past. Her figure, though slender, no longer seemed frail. Holmes nodded toward her. "She bears it with grace, but make no mistake, the harm lies not in what was done, but in what was denied. Time, truth, a mother." He turned to me fully. "And that, my dear Watson, no deduction, however precise, can ever restore." The storm had abated by the time we returned to Baker Street. Outside, the gas lamps flickered dimly in the pooling mist, and the last drops of rain tapped softly against the glass like forgotten memories seeking entry. Holmes sat opposite me, one long leg folded over the other, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had declined supper, as he often did when his mind remained tethered to the residue of a case. The fire crackled, casting a restless orange about the walls, and it was in that hushed chamber that Holmes finally spoke. "There are truths," he said, "which must be excavated not with tools, but with patience and precision." This was one such case. I nodded, for I too felt the lingering weight of what we had uncovered, not merely the resolution of a crime, but the slow lifting of a veil drawn across a young life. Holmes stirred in his chair. "Let us begin with Langmare." There was no flourish in his voice, no triumph, only the dispassionate clarity of a surgeon retracing the incision, not for praise but for the sake of understanding. "Langmare House," Holmes began, "was once a place of refuge, at least in name, but like many such institutions of the time, it also served as a convenient oubliette for society's undesirables, women shamed, ruined, or simply inconvenient. He stood to retrieve a small bundle from the bureau, the remnants we had brought back from the hidden chamber, the scorched letters, the worn child's cot, and the delicate braid wrapped carefully in linen. Evangeline Melford entered that house with hope, Holmes continued. She believed she was under the protection of kin, Mr. Merrow, who was then a man of rising legal influence. She was young, unmarried, and carrying a child, and she was in possession of a modest inheritance, left by her late father. Holmes paused. Merrow did not counsel her. He isolated her. He used her temporary instability, the melancholy not uncommon to expectant mothers, as cause to have her confined and declared unfit. Once her child was born, he ensured she would not leave. She wrote letters, to solicitors, to former acquaintances, but they were intercepted or destroyed. Eventually, she vanished from all record. Her death, likely by illness, was never reported. But her fortune was quietly transferred, and her child placed in Merrow's legal guardianship. Holmes set the braid down with something close to reverence. And so, Langmare became not merely a home for distressed women, but the tomb of one. Holmes resumed his seat, his gaze distant. Clara Melford, he said slowly, was raised on a scaffolding of omissions. No photographs, no maternal lullabies, no mention of a mother's face. Only Merrow's version of events, that she was an orphan of distant cousins, reared by duty and goodwill. In truth, she was kept in a glass case of deception. Her curiosity was treated as fragility. Her longing for knowledge met with reassurances that no answers existed. Merrow, Holmes went on, did not simply withhold facts, he replaced them. Her surname was retained, ironically, for it anchored her to the fiction. But every other thread of identity was snipped. I could not help but speak. And all this, so he might hold her inheritance. Holmes nodded. Yes. Though by the time Clara came of age, much of it had already been absorbed into his affairs. But the illusion had to persist, for to relinquish it would invite inquiry, and inquiry would uncover all. He drew a breath. She was not a ward. She was a possession, a living echo of a woman he had buried twice, once in flesh and again in memory. It was the letter, Holmes said quietly, the one that reached her, despite Merrow's vigilance. Who sent it? I asked. We may never know, he replied. It bore no return name, but within it was a reference to the name Evangeline, a name Clara had never heard, but which stirred something unspoken within her. She visited the printer, he continued, and attempted to place a notice in a widely read women's weekly, a message for anyone named Evangeline Melford to come forward. That impulse, seemingly innocent, was the match that ignited the tinder. Merrow must have learned of the attempt. Perhaps he intercepted the proof. Perhaps Clara's behaviour betrayed her new suspicion. Either way, it was then that he understood the facade was faltering. And Clara, Holmes concluded, began to awaken, not to danger, but to the scent of something long denied her. Truth. We sat in silence as Holmes closed the folder containing Evangeline's remnants. London beyond our window yawned into darkness, vast, veiled, and indifferent. She was lost, Holmes murmured, not in geography, but in silence. Like many. And as I looked into the hearth, I thought of the fog, the locked room, the whispered name barely remembered. Clara had been one of thousands. Children adrift in lies not of their making. And yet, Holmes added, memory, even buried, resists decay. And so, I wrote in my journal, she was found, not by miracle nor mercy, but by memory and the mind of Sherlock Holmes. The hour had grown late, and Baker Street lay in one of those rare lulls that come only after great storms, of weather or of spirit. A gentle rain murmured against the window panes, not in fury, but in steady rhythm, as if the sky itself had chosen to mourn in silence. I sat in my accustomed chair, opposite Holmes, whose figure was still as a statue, his gaze fixed not upon me, nor upon the fire, but somewhere beyond both. A single candle burned low upon the table, its wax collecting like ivory tears in the saucer below. Holmes had neither pipe nor paper in hand. He did not fidget nor speak. He merely watched the rivulets of rain chase one another across the glass, his mind, I knew, moving with deliberate force behind those quiet eyes. Outside, the fog returned, not with the heaviness of menace, but with the weight of history. It curled along the rooftops and coiled about the street lamps as though reluctant to relinquish its hold on the city. It was in such silence that the soul feels most keenly the residue of tragedy. And in Holmes that night, I saw not triumph, but a kind of reverent sorrow. Holmes stirred only once, and that was to reach beside him and retrieve a small leather-bound book worn at the spine and softened by years of handling. It was Evangeline's. Among the remnants from Langmare's basement, we had found it nestled within a bundle of personal effects, too trivial perhaps to warrant destruction, and thus left to dust and forgetfulness. He opened it not as one browsing for diversion, but as one seeking a whisper from the grave. His fingers paused upon a page whose edges were faintly smudged, the ink marked by the pressure of long-faded hands. He read, his voice low and even. There are truths not written in thunder, nor shouted through stone-bound halls, but those that lie quiet beneath silence, in the hush where memory calls. Holmes closed the book gently, almost reverently, and returned it to the table. For a long moment, we said nothing. There is a peculiar cruelty, he remarked at last, in the manner by which silence preserves injustice. The louder crimes draw notice, but those wrapped in quiet, they persist the longest. The rain continued its soft cadence, as if to agree. Holmes leaned back, his profile etched in candlelight, and spoke as if to the night beyond the window. London's fog, Watson, he said, has become almost a character in its own right, a veil drawn over deeds and faces, intentions and outcomes. But what it conceals is not always crime. Sometimes it is the very identity of the forgotten. He turned toward me then. We walk its streets, assuming visibility is truth, and obscurity, accident. But I wonder how many walk unseen. How many names lie blurred not by weather, but by the designs of men. I followed his gaze to the window. You believe there are others, then? I am certain of it, he replied. Clara was not an anomaly. She was simply one whose threads we managed to unpick. How many others vanish behind institutions, guardianships, reputations and paperwork? How many lives are rewritten, not by fire, but by omission? He paused, then added, It is not always the fog we ought to fear, but the hands that wield it. I found myself chilled, though the fire still glowed warm beside us. There are crimes, Holmes said, almost to himself, which leave no blood, no body, only silence, perfectly arranged. And I knew then, as ever, that Holmes had seen more in London's mist than most dared to imagine. I lay down my pen now and again, and reflect not upon the case as a series of deductions, but as a human tale. A quiet tragedy born of deliberate erasure. Clara Melford was called lost, yet it was not the disappearance of her body that struck me so profoundly. It was the theft of her name, her history, her claim to love and memory. She had wandered not from home, but from self. A girl severed from the very roots of her identity. She had, from childhood, been wrapped in a fiction composed with gentility and lies. The man who posed as her protector had instead rewritten the script of her life, making of her not a person, but a possession. And yet, she endured. She sought out a name she had never been told. She followed fragments of letters, feelings not yet understood, and whispers that reached through years of silence. Her journey was not one of miles, but of the soul, a reclamation not just of a mother's face, but of her own reflection. In the end, she was found, not merely on the docks of London, but in the truth denied her for a lifetime. Though time has since passed, I recall that final image with peculiar clarity. Clara Melford standing at our threshold, pale, composed, and no longer lost. It was not chance that restored her, nor mercy. It was the indelible nature of memory and the quiet resolve of a mind unwilling to let the past lie dormant. Sherlock Holmes, for all his logic, possessed a reverence for truth that went beyond fact. He pursued it not for glory, nor for fee, but because its absence left wounds that no court could dress. That night, as he sat in stillness beside the remnants of Evangeline's life, I saw in his eyes, not pride, but burden, the weight of having restored one life and the knowledge that 1,000 others might still wait in darkness. And so, the girl who had been lost was found, not by miracle, nor by mercy, but by memory and the mind of Sherlock Holmes. As we stepped out into the soft rain of Baker Street, Holmes paused beneath the lamplight, the faint glow catching the rim of his hat. "There is no greater cruelty," he said quietly, "than to rob a soul not of their life, but of their origin, to let them live, yet steal the meaning of their existence." I said nothing. The braid of auburn hair still lingered in my mind. "She was not simply a girl lost in London, Watson," he continued, "but one deliberately unmoored. And yet she found her truth not by luck, but by following what little light memory allowed. And with that we turned, the fog once again curling at our heels. What do you think? Was Mr. Merrow's greatest crime the act he committed against Evangeline? Or the identity he constructed for Clara? Which would you have uncovered first? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know how you would have solved the mystery. And if you enjoyed this case, don't forget to subscribe for more classic Sherlock Holmes investigations. And pass it along to fellow lovers of mystery and deduction.